You managed to see the documentary on Georgia Stevens? Not yet. Okay, that's very good. But you can get it on DVD. It's very, very informative. It's actually very beautiful, very well made. So, shall we start? Yeah. Okay. Good. Good. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ehsan Khoshbakht. I am the co-director with Cinema Ritrovato and the person in charge of the strand dedicated to the cinema of Georgia Stevens, something to live for the cinema of Georgia Stevens. It was actually Alice, the editor of the catalog, who's sitting in the back. She said, let's call it something to live for Georgia Stevens, and I absolutely love that. But the thing is, I realized that we have some non-believers among the film community, so I thought perhaps there was a bit too much. So we settle on the cinema, and then we talk about the character later. But actually, the whole process of preparing this retrospective was also about the man too, like the experience of studying him, learning more about him and his life. And I don't remember being so touched by the details, ups and downs in his life. Perhaps the only exception was Henry King 2 years ago, that you live with one person as a curator, a dead filmmaker for the whole year. And then I think the most rewarding thing in that process is that actually you come to understand his errors and mistakes as much as his, moments of glory. You understand why a filmmaker like Georgia Stevens is making certain choices, which are not the right choices, but it makes sense to you. And I think perhaps for me, curating is a way of understanding people, filmmaker. And that's, again, perhaps the most rewarding part of this process, this job that we do. So, on the stage with me is Imogen Sarah Smith. She's a film critic and film historian, author of 2 books, and we are going to engage in a conversation because you already know about my points about Stevens from the catalog now. So I'm more interested about what she thinks and how I can learn something or respond to Imogen and her ideas on Stevens, because she has written about Stevens. You can find some of the writings online, including a very fine piece on Swing Time, the musical. So just a few words before Stevens in general and the criteria for the selection of the films, and then we can start the conversation based around certain topics. I think it will last around 35 minutes. So in a town known for pettiness, Stevens always did what he thought was right, whether or not it helped his career. That was very essential to understanding him better, that I have noticed that in American cinema, people who are too powerful are not liked. People who are too weak, not weak in an artistic sense, but in a commercial sense, they're not liked either. It's a very unusual situation that to be that powerful and that influential. However, it's very interesting that you see in the opening title of the majority of his films that he's the producer. But in fact, he was struggling a lot and fighting a lot to get his projects done. And he was not liked. He was not liked for various reasons. He didn't give a damn about what the studio heads thought. And his daily rushes, didn't make sense. And that's one of the, I think, key points in getting close to Stevens, why his daily rushes didn't make sense, which for studio heads was very frustrating. So this program was conceived around a very simple theme. We all know the famous line by Theodor Adorno. It's barbaric to write poetry after Auschwitz. Okay, fair enough. But what is interesting is that Georgia Stevens saw the concentration camp, filmed the concentration camp. His filming of concentration camp became one of the documents of the Nuremberg trials. And in him, a kind of a poetic sensibility appeared, grew, which didn't exist before the war experience. And then I thought, if actually George Stevens hadn't filmed the liberation of Dachau, Theodor Adorno, who was in America in a university teaching, he was not in Europe. He couldn't see the footage to arrive at the conclusion that you cannot write poetry after the war. So, okay, you cannot write poetry after the war, but you need a filmmaker, moving images, someone like George Stevens, to do the job for you in order to arrive at a conclusion. So I decided to use the war experience, which I kind of emphasized by adding the documentary from D-Day to Berlin, just to show how the man changed and how those changes of attitude, of the approach to cinema, of the way he used to describe people, kind of made his post-war filmography and his post-war career. And I think just one tiny example of the places that you don't expect to see the war experience appearing, or rather being heard. A Place in the Sun. For the sound of the motorboat, he used the sound of a German jet fighter. So he was living with that experience, and a film which has nothing to do with the Second World War. You see that the idea of terror, of fear, of destruction, which appears in some of his post-war films, is the direct result of what he saw and what he felt. And another thing that I can add is that among the famous 5 directors, there were more than 5, but the 5 that we know better than the rest, George Stevens, John Huston, William Wyler, Frank Capra, and John Ford. The five came back, which is also the title of a very wonderful book by Mark Harris. He and William Wyler were the only ones who went to the end of the line. This is another key to George Stevens' work. The end of the line meant to Berlin. John Ford, when they landed in Normandy, got very emotional and went on one of his Irish drinking binges, and then he was eventually dismissed. Frank Capra was an office man, but Stevens went until the end, and this is also the story of his career. Going for something, no matter right or wrong, in many cases very right, he went until the end of the line. And so when you talk about Stevens between the mid-30s until the end of his life, you talk of a man in total control of his films. He was a very self-conscious and even analytical filmmaker, and even confident enough that at some point he said that author theory is the ideal way of describing films, and it's the ideal situation for making films. And he even fell into the trap of the theory, because his very last film is it was set in Las Vegas, but it was shot in Paris with Henri Descailles, the French cinematographer, and with Warren Beatty and Elizabeth Taylor, in which Elizabeth Taylor is watching John Ford films on television all the time, and it's a remake of Suing Time. So it's as if a director is so conscious that he's trying to do a remake of his films the way Howard Hawks towards the end of his life was doing. And you could see that this is a man who is making the film as much as for the audience as he always did, also for the critics. The film was not successful, but it's a very good example to show how he took the job seriously, and also he took the reception of his films seriously. So we can start from the beginning, and the beginning could be his involvement in the production of Laurel and Hardy films as a cameraman, which we both saw many elements of Laurel and Hardy, even in his most serious dramas. So maybe Imogen could start with this.
Sure, thank you. Yes, so is this on? Everyone can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So Stevens was born in California in 1904, and his parents were in the theater, so he grew up sort of knowing show business from the very beginning. When he was still a teenager, he got a job as a cameraman at the Hal Roach studio, which was one of the two major studios producing comedy in the 1920s. And one was Max Sennett, which is really the kind of crazy, wild slapstick, very fast-paced, very sort of, nonsensical. And then Hal Roach was much slower paced, much more about sort of human situations and emotions. And Stevens particularly worked with Laurel and Hardy. And yes, as you were saying, Ehsan, throughout his whole career, you can see how that is forming his style. And one of the main things is to do with the pacing. Laurel and Hardy, the sort of innovation of their comedy was to slow everything down. Instead of the idea that comedy has to be fast, 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 people running around, it's to slow down and focus on reactions, on very sort of almost clockwork timing, and of setting up a gag so that you actually see what's coming and then it comes, and yet somehow the way that it's choreographed and presented is so perfect that it's very funny. So he really learned this kind of mechanics of the gag and this comic timing and this sense of the rhythm, the sort of internal rhythm in a gag. And then you see this not only with his wonderful comic timing in his comedies, but when he goes on to start making more serious films, I still feel like a lot of what is so wonderful about them is to do with the rhythm and the pacing. I felt that particularly with Something to Live For, which I had not seen before. I just saw it the other night, and it's a total, for those of you who haven't seen it, drama, really no comedy in it. It's about two people both struggling with alcoholism. But there's something about, like he calls her and she's not there, and she calls him and he's not there. And the way everything flows and is choreographed is really beautiful. And I don't know, it kind of made me think about how much of cinema and maybe life is about timing. And there's so many wonderful moments in Stevens, in A Place in the Sun, when there's this moment when Montgomery Clift and Elizabeth Taylor meet, and he's just, made this shot with the billiard table. She appears, she says, wow. And it's like the way that it's timed is so perfect. But so his comedy was always about the sort of sustained, the way he sustains a scene, the way he sustains a reaction shot. And it's a very risky way of making comedy, because if it doesn't work, it's really deadly. It's not like Howard Hawks, where it's all very fast, and if one thing isn't great, well, it's on to the next thing. But this is like, he makes you sit with it. And he's particularly interested in kind of moments of embarrassment or awkwardness. And interestingly, when he moved away from comedy, so the sort of easy way to think of his career is he made comedies in the 30s, he went to war, he saw the liberation of Dachau, he never made another comedy. That's a little bit of an oversimplification, because he was already making serious films before the war. And I Remember Mama, his first film back after the war, has a lot of comedy, but still, that's basically, he moved away from making comedies. And he was thinking, in seeing this kind of ultimate in human humiliation and degradation in the camps, it made him uncomfortable about comedy, because comedy is so often has elements of cruelty or elements of people being humiliated. And so I think it made it difficult for him to continue with that. But so there's the timing, the pacing, but I think even with Laurel and Hardy, he felt very much that as he said, they understood something about the human condition and something about the humanism, the compassion of his films, which I feel is there both in the comedies and the dramas, his sort of sensitivity and his interest in the way people interact. I mean, you were saying the other day about how much is about the gaze and about people reacting to each other. So a lot of things can be seen kind of coming out of that place where he started.
Right. It's at least two of his biographers say that one of the reasons first of all, he didn't like comedy at all. He didn't want to do comedy, and he was not comfortable with it at the beginning. And they say that it was because his parents, who were stage actors, comedy actors, both drama actors and comedy actors, they were not good in comedy. And there is nothing more humiliating than a father who thinks he's funny, but actually he's not funny. And there are stories about him just sitting there backstage and the father making the jokes on the stage and nobody laughing. So this kind of painful and tense that, are they going to laugh? Are they going to laugh? And at the same time, just kind of shifting between comical and serious. That I don't want to do comedy, I want to do comedy. So this is perhaps something for Stevens, something which dates back to his early days, and for me, not necessarily the war experience, that whole awkwardness of these situations, but also for me, Laurel and Hardy gave him the which you explained differently. For me, it's the idea of delay, silence, and pause. So his films are constantly on pause. It's very risky that you have to pause the emotions, and you will see what is going to happen now.
And there's a tension, and so I feel like that tension is actually what is powerful in his films, but it can make them uncomfortable to watch. And there is an experience of almost being not sure, like, do I feel uncomfortable because this is not working? Or do I feel uncomfortable because I'm supposed to feel uncomfortable, because the characters feel uncomfortable? And again, to go back to something to live for, I thought what was so powerful about that film is the way this tension is maintained throughout the entire film. It's about, this character who is trying to stop drinking, and you keep waiting for him to take a drink, and he keeps almost doing it, and then he pulls back, and he almost does it, and he pulls back. And it's also two people who are, very attracted to each other, but he's married. They don't, they can't be together. And so the whole film has this tension. And I don't know, when I think about, as you say, people who are not convinced about George Stevens, I wonder if some of it is a bit of the sense that some of his films are actually kind of painful to watch, but I think sometimes in a very ultimately rewarding way. But one other thing I wanted to say about what he got from working with Laurel and Hardy is I imagine that he liked to improvise, and he was the opposite of the kind of director, like Hitchcock, who comes in and knows exactly what he wants. I mean, you were talking about the rushes and how they didn't make sense to people. And maybe we can talk a little bit about the way he worked, because it was very distinctive to him. He liked to rehearse, he liked to improvise. Some, like the very famous scene in The More the Merrier, where they're sitting on the front stoop, this, scene that Frank Capra said was, the one of the sexiest scenes in cinema. I totally agree. They came up with that on the set with the actors sort of improvising together. So he liked to do that. He also liked to film a lot and then kind of figure out what he was going to do in the editing room. And I feel like that was very much the way silent comedy was made. It was never made with a script. It was, you started with a basic idea and you sort of saw what happened. And so somehow there's this sense that we've been talking about of how sort of precise he could be, and yet he was also very much kind of letting things grow organically. But he was also famous for being, sort of he would
Stone
pace
face.
up and down, and he would brood, and he would have this dead, face that nobody couldn't tell what he was thinking. So I don't know. Reading about the way he works really, I think, made me understand more about how personal his films were to him.
It's almost so, the production process is almost like it's experimental by Hollywood standards. For instance, in A Place in the Sun, the famous kissing scene, right? So he shot that scene from 4 different angles, but before doing that, he changed the script last minute and asked Liz Taylor and Monty Clift to just go through the lines as if they are out of breath. And when they were in kind of this shock that they have to do the scene with a new text, he started filming them, and with a lens which was, especially for a kissing scene, unheard of. Basically, he wanted the audience to be part of that embrace, part of that kiss. But what is even more interesting, the way he cut the film, is almost like Chelsea Girls by Andy Warhol. Instead of doing it on Moviella, he shot reaction shots. He was projecting them at the same time, everything that he had filmed on 2 screens, and trying to find a formula, how to combine everything, the shots and the reaction shots. So for the studio, it was very painful because they couldn't figure out what kind of film is going to be. But this is also something else in his way of filmmaking, that his films, even when they are literary adaptations, they are not plot-driven. They are based around scenes. Like, I Remember Mama is the perfect example. It's just a series of scenes about sometimes the most simple, ordinary, or mundane things. A cat. It's not about a child dying, but it's rather about the mother wanting to go and visit the child in the hospital. So he always goes for the very, very simple, and then he creates this expanded thing around that with his technique. And for some actors and actresses, it was so unusual that they were not sure if it was the right choice to work with Stevens. The best example is, of course, Katharine Hepburn, because Alice Adams is known as the key, the turning point in his career. Hepburn wanted Stevens, but when the shoot started, she was not sure anymore because he was not directing her. He was only interested in the camera, in the angle. However, just to show how precise he was, if you go and watch A Place in the Sun again, with all these different camera angles and different setups and miles and miles of footage, every time we see a shot of Shelley Winter's apartment, it's just one setup. It's a setup from behind the sink every single time. So throughout the picture, you just see one shot of Shelley Winter's, because that's all he needs. So he knows what he wants. Probably he gets many different things, but he doesn't feel like, okay, now I have 10 different setups in this room. I need 10 different cuts. No, just one cut can tell the story.
Yeah, and the kissing, that famous kiss, it's almost becomes abstract. And I really like what you said about him being driven by these scenes. I mean, almost in the way that you think of, Hitchcock not being interested in plot or story, but being interested in finding a way to include these bits that he wanted. And it's almost like that. And A Place in the Sun is an example where it was an adaptation of a novel by Theodore Dreiser called An American Tragedy, which was based on a true crime story. It had previously been adapted by Joseph von Sternberg under the title An American Tragedy. When Stevens wanted to make it, the Sternberg version had been a flop, so the studio didn't want to do it again. He had to convince them. He then proceeded to completely sort of turn the story on its head and change the characters very much and change the interpretation. And it was like he was driven by needing to find a way to create that scene and these certain scenes, these certain, very intensely emotional moments that he wanted, more than he was, following what the sort of themes were in the book.
And it's very ironic because in A Place in the Sun, he promised the studio that the first version of the film by Paramount, directed by Joseph von Sternberg, was a flop. And he kept saying it was a flop because it was not faithful to the book. And, his Sternberg's version is a good film. It has a bad reputation, but it's much better than its reputation. And what he did is, I have not read the novel, but I have read a detailed synopsis of it. And comparing to Sternberg, he did a completely different take on that.
Yes, I have read the novel. The Sternberg book is actually quite faithful. For those of you who have seen An American Tragedy or seen A Place in the Sun, of course, it's a sort of love triangle. And the two women are of different social classes. And in the book, it is really about social class. The reason he wants to be with the rich girl is because she's he's trying to climb to another social class. It's not because she's more attractive, he's more attracted to her, love, anything like that. It really is about this idea of him being driven by this desire to better himself. And Stevens was insistent on wanting to create this extreme contrast between the two women. And everyone was telling him, Montgomery Clift was telling him, you're ruining it. This is not, you shouldn't be having her play the part in this way. This is not what it's about. And he was famously very stubborn. When he knew what he wanted, he would just do it, and sort of nobody could change his mind. And I think it's fascinating that ultimately what he wanted to do is really what makes that film work, even though it's not really what the book is. But something I'd like to ask you about and talk about, and that is a good thing to come from A Place in the Sun about, is his interest in outsiders. That many of his films are really driven by this idea of someone who feels like an outsider and wants to belong. I mean, this is very much Alice Adams and A Place in the Sun.
It's the thing he had for Jesus.
Yes. So I've actually not read the biography. I've read Five Came Back, which is a wonderful book. But I'm very curious what you think his personal connection with that was.
Imogen, there's absolutely nothing about any sort of religious upbringing in him. But I made a very outrageous proposal a few nights ago when I was introducing A Place in the Sun at Lunedì Arena, that I said, when you look at the final scene, think of this man preparing himself for his penultimate film, which was the story of Jesus, the greatest story ever told. Because the way Montgomery Clift walks to the death chamber to electric chair in absolute tranquility, total submission and acceptance of the situation, and then the dissolve on the shot of Liz Taylor of the back to the kissing scene is quite stunning. So when did it start? I have no idea, but you can see signs of it in I Remember Mama, which is a very key film, especially in the text they are reciting in the film. It's either Dickens, the different books are read in the film, and you see signs of it there that he's going for that. And he wanted to do the film about the life of Christ, which became one of his biggest flops. And it's to be totally fair, I don't care much about that film, but mostly because, the story was already done much better in Shane, for instance. Again,
Shane,
back to Shane, the final shot of the Shane.
The outsider.
The outsider, but also the final shot, we see the boy saying Shane, and he disappears. But we, as the audience, see something that the boy doesn't see, that Shane passes through the graveyard before vanishing in the horizon. And we don't know whether he's already dead or dying. We don't know that. But this is the most direct link between these films, between the greatest story ever told, Shane, and A Place in the Sun. And back to the concept of the Messiah-like loner, it's becomes very fascinating when you remember that he, in the greatest story ever told, he doesn't show miracles. So he refuses, unlike all other films based on the life of Jesus, he doesn't show miracles. So he tries to turn Jesus introduced Lunar, an ordinary man with ideas. It could be something, again, like Laura Hardy, because a man, innocent, wants to do good, but the world is not ready for it. The world doesn't want it, and things go wrong, and it ends in tragedy.
Something else, though, that strikes me about this partly this outsider idea is how many of his films are also about kind of one person watching or observing another person, because that's what I Remember Mama is all about. It's about the daughter looking at her mother and gradually coming to understand her. And it ends with this view of her framed in the window from outside, which is something that he loves to do. He does this in Alice Adams as well, where you see somebody in the window, and he likes to move the camera, through the wall, and suddenly, you go from being inside to being outside. But Shane is all about Shane is seen through the eyes of the boy, So his interest in sort of who is really whose point of view are we seeing? And you have the figures who are being watched, and you have the figures who are the watchers.
Yeah.
And A Place in the Sun is very much about George, gazing at this life that he wants and this woman that he wants. So it makes them very much like they're almost sort of about the movies and the way that we are gazing at people on the screen.
Right. It's interesting that before the war, again, a contrast between before and after the war. Before the war, in Alice Adams, at least the ending that exists, not the original ending that he wanted to film, or in Virgil in the Night, which is a fine film, you see the acceptance. So you see the encounter between an outsider with a society or group, and then gradual acceptance of that person. But after the war, he completely rejects the idea of acceptance. It just vanishes from his films. But I also have something to add to the idea of inside, outside. Because there is another very good book about Stevens, a book of interviews with him from the University of Mississippi Press. Highly recommended. Because, for instance, I learned from that book that you see shots of windows in his films a lot. So the scene is shot from outside the window, from inside. He does that a lot. And the reason he is that because, I don't feel like intruding and breaking the privacy of a character. I always need that distance. And that distance for me could be props. Like I Remember Mama is a very good example because he was putting so many props in the scene that the actors or actresses bumping into things and making them look awkward, which was exactly the effect he wanted to give to reach. And also in The More the Merrier, almost all his films, and also in Something to Live For. So you have always this distance with the characters through the elements of a space, architecture and furniture, and he was very aware of that since the early 30s, and he knew he wanted to approach a scene like that.
Yeah, it's very noticeable in Something to Live For, where there are all these shots through the cage elevator and sort of objects in the foreground cluttering things up. But yes, I mean, you have these characters like the mama character played by Irene Dunne, who is the central character, but you also, in a sense, you're only seeing her through somebody else's eyes, and so there is this sense of distance.
Yeah.
Maybe we should
go ahead.
Talk a little bit about women. And
you start, please. Yeah.
I mean, he was in the 30s. He was known for comedy, but he was also very much known as a director of women. Katharine Hepburn, Irene Dunne, Jean Arthur, Ginger Rogers in Swing Time, and a film called Vivacious Lady, which I think is not here. But it's interesting. I mean, because he's very different from somebody like Cukor, who is thought of as the sort of quintessential woman's director. But I don't know, to me it's somewhat connected with the way that he often directed actors who were known for comedy, but he gave them the opportunity to do something either more serious, like Cary Grant in Penny Serenade, the sort of first real dramatic performance that he gave. Or even if it's a comedy, it's a very different kind of comedy from the kind where you're expected to be constantly wisecracking. And, you know, in the 30s especially, there's this particular kind of woman character who's very sort of very, very hard-boiled, very sort of always has a snappy comeback. And that was very much what Ginger Rogers tended to play. And he gives them something that's much more vulnerable, much more sort of human, and this is one of the things that makes Swing Time so much more satisfying than the other Astaire Rogers films. But I think one of the reasons probably that these women liked working with him was he wasn't sort of giving them the usual kind of comedy parts, but something that is more, there's much more space for them to sort of be real in a way.
What do you think about the kitchen scene of The Woman of the Year? Because I know Marilyn Almas, the author of one of the books on Stevens, I mean, she's furious at that scene. What do you know? We talked to another.
Yes, I know. We talked
scholar,
to someone
yeah.
who, and she and I disagreed. I have to say I've not seen that film, and I didn't see it here. I've not seen it in a little while, and maybe I should give it another look. I've always been very bothered by this. This is the scene where Katharine Hepburn tries to cook breakfast for her husband at the end, and you know, it's a total disaster, and it's a comedy scene, but it was explicitly, it was not the original ending. It was added because apparently audiences in the original previews felt that this Katharine Hepburn's character had not been punished enough. You know, she needed to be taken down a peg, which was what audiences tended to think of Katharine Hepburn. You know, they wanted to see her kind of have this humiliating moment. And I mean, I do agree with what you wrote, which is that the way that she and Spencer Tracy play together kind of saves it from being as sort of, you know, much of just a punishment of her as it could be. But so we spoke with another woman film scholar who really said she kind of not only thought it was very, very funny, but sort of connected with it from her own personal experience. So,
and she said that there was a thing he had when she married her husband, and I asked her, did you eventually divorce him? And she said yes, but not for the eggs.
But I think it goes back to what we were saying, or I was saying earlier about comedy and how tonally comedy is difficult because it can come across as a humiliation of someone, and how you play that tone and whether you want, you know, how you can make a comedy in which you can still connect with someone emotionally. I mean, that's sort of the evolution of comedy out of silent comedy, which often, you know, in its earliest form is very kind of heartless, and, you know, when somebody falls down, it's just funny. And if you want to make a story in which you actually are, you know, have feelings for the characters as human beings, you can't laugh at them in the same way. And so then it becomes this, how do you maintain this tone where you can laugh at people and it can be funny, but, you know, it doesn't just come across, you know, because in real life, you know, to be laughed at can, as you said, I mean, try to be funny and nobody laughs is really humiliating, but it's also humiliating if people laugh at you when you don't want them to. The scene that really works for me, though, is the dinner table scene in Alice Adams, which is also a scene that is, you know, kind of becomes ultimately quite painful. This is where she's invited her boyfriend to have dinner with her family, and it's this catastrophe. And it works, it has this kind of trajectory of starting out just being very funny, and Hattie McDaniel's very funny, Fred Stone is very funny, and it is, you know, it's like a Laurel, you know, it's a lot of it is coming directly from those Laurel and Hardy comedies, you know, where they're waiting on table or something. But then ultimately at the end, it just becomes more and more painful as she is kind of going into this manic mode of trying to keep up this face as it's all a disaster. But I don't know, emotionally for me, it both is funny and it's you feel for her, but it doesn't feel cruel to me.
Right. Fair enough. As the last subject, maybe we could talk about the place of Stevens in American film history, and back to the idea of non-believers, because the first book on Stevens was done by Donald Ritchie, and he's very ambiguous about Stevens, and he calls him an American romantic. The problem is he studies him as a romantic, but it's from the point of view of a person who detests romanticism, at least, you know, the 19th century romanticism that we know. And so that was the very first text which was done on him in English. And that was not a very, I think, not a very accurate start. So how do you see his place in American cinema today? And especially, you know, in relation to the program we had here and this particular selection of films.
I think that is actually a surprisingly kind of a difficult question. And in a way, it goes back to what you were saying at the very beginning about, I feel like certain films and certain filmmakers who had great kind of mainstream success, people just aren't even interested in looking that closely, because it's kind of like Shane. Okay, we all saw Shane when we were kids, and, you know, Place in the Sun, everybody knows this film. I feel like there's almost a sense that people think of him as a known quantity without actually having really looked hard at the films. And I actually think that Mark Harris's book, Five Came Back, because Steve, you know, it is about his war experience, and he is so much sort of the most interesting and the person you come away from that book liking the most. I think for me, that made me, I did not know before reading the book about his whole wartime experience. And I think that led a lot of people to look at him differently, and to reevaluate the shape of his career. I don't know. I haven't really. I'm sort of saying this from the observation of a small number of people, but yeah, I feel like there's a bit of a sense of him as just one of these Hollywood studio filmmakers who doesn't get seen as being personal in the way that I feel like when you start looking at the films closely, as we have and as we've had a chance to all together at this festival, you start to see him as a much more personal, original filmmaker.
The thing is that because mise-en-scène has been used so subjectively, with kind of course, there's no criteria for it, and each person, each writer, critic use it in a different way. When you look at the films, the sense of direction and mise-en-scène is completely there, and it's for me, it remains one of those mysteries of cinema, which also applies to some other directors. William Wyler also suffers from the same phenomenon. Mostly people who, towards the end of their lives, did big budget films, and they were mostly flops. And people who were independent, had their film company, they were director producers. So they share that. He shares that with Wyler. And in fact, I learned from George Stevens Jr. that Catherine Wyler was here a couple of years ago, and they're very good friends, both living in Washington, D.C. So they remain very close until the very end. And this is something that you see like a problem which also applies to William Wyler's films. But, you know, when you look at the films, they are there, and there is a sense of direction, of the control of space, a man who is into the emotions of characters, a man who understands human beings. And after all, you know, when we talk about cinema, we always use these things, these themes or these entries as important and significant in appreciating and understanding a director. And it remains a mystery that why this was not understood or accepted when it came to George Stevens. But hopefully, if someone makes this new beautiful version of Something to Live For available, at least this is a film that I know at least one person here who didn't care much about the Stevens but liked the film very much. So I hope in near future people go and look more of of his films. And there is a new book which came out last year by Neil Senior, which is the more detailed book done on Stevens, which is highly recommended. So, do you want to say something?
I mean, I think you've covered it well, but I think I was just thinking also about the fact that part of perhaps the problem of people sort of seeing the films but not seeing Stevens has something to do with how the stars, that people think of them as star vehicles in a way, and I think that watching a number of them together is when you actually start to see how many connections there are, how much he is putting into them. But yes, I mean, I couldn't agree more about the fact that just when you look at the direction and look at them visually and what he's doing with the way he choreographs the scenes and everything, I mean, it's really it's a kind of master class in direction. So
yeah, I went for searching for a great director, and I returned with a great director with lots of soul, which is again for me the link with Henry King, and he has lots of it. Okay, thank you so much for your interest and your patience. We still have a couple of George Stevens films playing tomorrow. Hope you enjoy it, and looking forward to seeing you next year with another American master. Thank you very much.